Russian-Israeli oligarch Roman Abramovich is thought to be worth around $10 billion. That, of course, is the wealth we know about, and how exactly he made that fortune has always been somewhat mysterious. But we do know that the billionaire is no stranger to financial scandal. The former Chelsea Football Club owner has admitted paying out billions in exchange for political favours in the former Soviet Union. He's been linked to a scandal involving a fraudulent $5 billion loan from the IMF, and he's been accused of donating over $100 million to a group supporting Israeli settlers on Palestinian territory. Now, it's no surprise to learn he's not a good guy. After all, he's a billionaire. But life hasn't always been easy for the world's 155th richest man. In 2022, the UK government imposed sanctions on Abramovich over his links to Russian President Vladimir Putin following the start of the Ukraine war. A month later, the island of Jersey, a tax haven, froze £5.5 billion worth of his assets, while 12 luxury properties in France were seized by the French authorities, also over his links to Putin. God, imagine having one luxury property seized and then having 12. The tragedy, all 12 luxury properties seized. Now, though, Abramovich is facing a new financial headache, and given it's the end of January, it's a familiar one for anyone who has to fill out a self-assessment tax return. Yes, it's a surprise bill from HMRC. That's because it turns out Abramovich might owe the taxman around £1 billion in unpaid taxes. Who hasn't forgotten to pay the taxman a little billion? A joint investigation between The Guardian, the BBC, and the Centre for Investigative Journalism has revealed this. Leaked papers and court filings shed new light on how the income from a $6 billion cash pile amassed by one of the world's richest men was managed. The former owner of Chelsea FC entrusted nearly half of his fortune to more than 200 hedge funds, including some of the world's most prestigious money managers, using a circuitous structure routed through Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands, the files show. The structures endured until at least 2022, when Abramovich was among a group of powerful Kremlin allies hit with sanctions by Western governments in response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, what's being alleged as potential tax evasion revolves around that complex corporate structure called the Key Grove structure, after an Abramovich-linked Virgin Islands holding company. It was allegedly used to manage Abramovich's affairs. And at the heart of it is this man, Eugene Schweidler, seen here with Abramovich, sometimes described as Abramovich's right-hand man. Schweidler is a fellow Russian who moved to the UK in 2004 and became a citizen in 2010 under the Golden Visa scheme, where you could basically buy residency here if you had enough dirty money. The question of whether tax is liable is governed by a simple rule. First, find the person who has what HMRC calls the highest level of control. So in this case, that's alleged to be Schweidler, who appears to have controlled many of Abramovich's investment decisions. Second, work out where the person making those decisions was located. According to the leaked papers and court filings, if Schweidler was controlling the investment, he appears to have been doing so from the UK. If that's all true, what does it mean for Abramovich? This is from The Guardian. Analysis of the data suggests that between 2004 and 2018, profits made by the Key Grove structure could be as high as $3.8 billion. If this is the case, the amount of any unpaid UK tax could be £536 million. That's according to analysis examined by tax experts. Were HMRC to conclude that Abramovich's companies had failed to pay this sum, they would also be charged interest on the total avoided, amounting to at least £145 million. Companies that fail to pay tax and do not disclose this voluntarily are also subject to late payment penalties of up to 70% of the unpaid sum if the failure is deemed deliberate. Depending on the severity of the case, HMRC could demand between £651 million and £1 billion, analysis suggests. If a liability is due, some could be time barred due to the length of time that has passed. Lawyers for Schweidler have denied him being knowingly or negligently involved in an unlawful scheme to avoid paying tax, as you'd imagine they would. But the UK scheme is just one vehicle that Abramovich is alleged to have used to evade tax. There's another story connected to this one that's even more creative. This is the Eclipse mega yacht. Looks gorgeous. valued at £700 million. It was bought by Abramovich in 2010. It boasts 2 helicopter pads because one is just not enough, 24 guest cabins, 2 swimming pools, several hot tubs, and a disco hall. It even comes with its own submarine, as well as missile launchers and a missile detection system. Are you allowed to have missile launchers on just a luxury yacht? I don't know. I don't think you should be. This is just one of the 5 luxury yachts bought by Abramovich. They really are taking a piss of us, aren't they? One of 5 luxury yachts held by Abramovich during the 2000s. It was allegedly used in another tax dodge involving a complex corporate structure. This is from the BBC, who've been studying the same batch of leaked papers. The files reveal how Mr. Abramovich's advisors helped him avoid paying huge tax bills on the yacht's running costs in the EU waters by using companies to hire them out to himself or other companies he controlled. Documents show how the 5 yachts were leased to a company in Cyprus called Blue Ocean Yacht Management, which chartered them onto a handful of companies in the British Virgin Islands that appeared independent, but which were all, in fact, controlled by Mr. Abramovich. In other words, the allegation is that Abramovich avoided tax by hiring his luxury yachts from himself and then writing off their running costs as a business expense. If true, Abramovich could have avoided paying millions and potentially tens of millions of tax and VAT. Lawyers working for Abramovich have said that he denies, quote, any allegation that he had any knowledge or was personally responsible or liable for any alleged deception of any government authority to evade tax. I wonder how much you get paid as a lawyer to just sort of give the BBC a statement. Anything you're accusing him of, he denies. That which seems to be what this denial amounts to. Right? I'm sure they're getting paid millions. What do they charge by the hour to send the BBC that email? I would send the BBC that email. Some of our elected representatives, as you'd imagine, have questions for Abramovich. Joe Powell MP chairs a cross-party parliamentary group on anti-corruption and responsible tax. He told The Guardian this: I'd like to see HMRC thoroughly investigate whether corporation tax or any other taxes are owed by Abramovich on these operations. More widely, I think it's a good test case for whether HMRC and other regulators have the enforcement capacity they need to make cases of this nature. To be fair, I could have written that statement as well. If you're a lawyer, you send the BBC an email saying he denies any charges you might throw at him. And if you're an MP, you say this should be investigated thoroughly. Helena, I suppose presumably this should be investigated thoroughly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, the one thing I would say though, I think this does show kind of the failure that we have of the social democratic idea of governance, which is that well, it doesn't really matter if we don't have too many guardrails on capitalism and free markets as a system, because what we can do is we can just tax things back and then redistribute from there. That's one of Gary Stevenson's big prescriptions that he's got. Someone I'm a big fan of, which is that once these rich people have all of these assets, all you need to do is tax them back, and then you can use them to be able to recoup assets for the people and for the state. One of the big problems of this, of course, is that there have been and have historically been so many ways. Once these people have managed to accrue this huge amount of wealth, once we do this deregulation, once we do this kind of reduce the overall level of taxation for people who are on high assets, who have high incomes, so that they can then amass these huge amounts of wealth that they historically have done since we reduced our tax levels and deregulated our economies broadly in the 1979 onwards, is that once they are this rich, they find infinite number of ways of being able to put things through different system to avoid different kinds of taxation, and then of course can get in pretty favorable positions with politicians where the actual legislation that could theoretically be there to bring these people to heel doesn't actually get pulled forward. I mean, of course, in this specific case, there's going to be a protracted legal discussion. This is going to 10, 20 years after a lot of these things have happened. So it has taken a very long time, having him done all of this potential tax avoidance, this alleged tax avoidance, to potentially actually get this recouped after a lot of the damage has already been done to a pretty large extent. Like the issue, of course, in my concern is rather than levels of taxation, it's levels of ownership. And we've allowed a cohort of incredibly rich people to have huge amounts of ownership. We saw what happened in the Soviet Union turning into Russia with the shock therapy that allowed Roman Abramovich to be able to amass this huge amounts of wealth. But that's basically what we've done in the UK and the United States too, especially in the UK, as we had a big flash sale in the 80s that gave us our own set of oligarchs in a similar fashion. And they have many ways of being able to loop around the levels of taxation to be able to claw our assets back. And so we're going to have to reclaim ownership somehow. And that's going to involve pretty radical ideas of how we change policy to do that. Because we had a system. We lived. There was literally part of HMRC that was created under the Conservative government too. Like this wasn't like a lefty government that did this. There was a specific department of theirs which was there to crack down very heavily on corporate levels of tax avoidance. And there were pretty hefty fines and penalties for people who were part of these institutions if they didn't whistleblow to the government on potential levels of tax avoidance in their corporations. How many people might have actually been brought to heel by this particular arm of government since it was set up in 2016? Zero. Absolutely nobody. So, of course, we could elect politicians that are going to be pretty heavy handed in terms of dealing with tax avoidance. Probably we will get more of that. Richard Rees talked pretty heavily about closing the tax gap at the last election. But this is a sticking plaster solution, one that Keir Starmer says that he doesn't like, on top of a really kind of deep cut in terms of our public finances and our public realm, which is about too many people own too few people owning too much of the assets of this country. And this is a good start, but things are going to have to get more serious and more radical if we're going to have a proper redistribution of wealth in this country.